First, it is worth considering from whence identity comes and how reliable it is. In other words, how much confidence should the relying party have that the ID establishes the person is who he or she claims to be. This figure is a representation of the interdependencies among the person, the identity proofer, and the relying party. At the center of these relationships is an assessment of risk and impact. Basically, what are the consequences of error or fraud? And what is it worth to me as a relying party to minimize the chance of that happening? In some cases, the consequences are minimal, like issuing a discount card for a grocery store. So not a lot of time or resources need to be spent on identity proofing. At the other end of the spectrum, the consequences can be grave, like programs by the US government about determining who has access to classified information. That risk assessment should inform all elements of the identity ecosystem. Next slide, please. The 2018 ANSI NASCO standard on identity proofing lays out a four-step process for enrolling an identity. Relying parties can use this framework in deciding whether a type of ID is suitable for its purposes. Step one, the preliminary or design stage. This includes the risk assessment, which we just discussed, which then informs what information is collected and what procedures are used to look for error or fraud. Step two is assertion. The individual claims an identity, usually in the form of a combination of biographic data, perhaps tied to a biometric like a facial image. The identity provider resolves the claimed identity down to a unique individual. In other words, the process should prevent Ted Sobel from DHS from being confused with Ted Sobel, who is a professional weightlifter in California. The standard lays out combinations of biographical data that can be used to achieve a high degree of accuracy. For example, TSA primarily uses full name and date of birth to minimize misidentifications when vetting nearly 2 million air travelers per day. Step three is verification. Collect and review supporting evidence needed to link the claimed identity to the individual. Safeguards might include training employees to spot fraud, electronic verification of documents, checks against source records, forensics, etc. As a side note, the process in place that was put in place in step one should be there to support the verification. In other words, when you're designing the system and designing what data you collect, understand how you're going to be using it so you can collect once and not have to ask multiple times. Step four is determination. That's just a simple yes or no decision on whether the individual is who or she claims to be. If you understand how identity providers implement steps 1 through 3, you will know whether you can rely on the determination in step 4. Next slide, please. So a few words about driver's licenses. First, they are by far the most commonly used and accepted forms of IDs in the United States. Each state determines for itself the enrollment process used to issue the driver's licenses, so you can have some variations. Enrollment processes and cards continue to evolve and get enhanced, that there are generations and cycles where they're constantly incorporating best practices and lessons learned. The American Association for Motor Vehicle Administrators, AMVA, assists the states in this responsibility through publishing guidelines and providing training and promoting best practices. So what we have on this slide is a list of the requirements for REALID. The REALID Act of 2005 establishes voluntary minimum standards for the secure issuance and production of state-issued driver's licenses and non-driver IDs. It does not authorize the federal government the power to regulate driver's licenses. It does not create national databases. It does not create a national ID. Instead, it directs the Department of Homeland Security to establish what identity proofing is needed for the federal government to accept a driver's license for entering federal facilities and nuclear power plants, or for boarding federally regulated commercial aircraft. About 2/3 of REALID concerns creating a baseline for secure identity proofing, such as what data helps establish identity, what documents can serve as evidence of that identity, which systems can be used to verify that identity in those documents. Are employees trained to spot fraud? Are safeguards in place to prevent insider threat? These requirements lead to a stronger identity, whether you are looking at cards or mobile driver's licenses. For relying parties, you'll need to know when you see a REALID compliant card or a REALID marked mobile driver's license, that you can be confident that the identity was proved at the federal government's baseline or above, without necessarily needing to know the details how each state handles proofing. Next slide, please. A word of caution as we have now reached nationwide compliance with REALID. Not all licenses that you will encounter will be REALID compliant. Most states continue to offer their residents the option of getting a non-compliant card. The reason to get a non-compliant card may vary. It could be due to cost. It could be due to a person being unwilling or unable to prove lawful presence. It could be just a simple personal preference. Non-compliant cards will lack the REALID star and include a statement similar to "not for federal identification." In the mDL world, a digital marker will be used to distinguish between a compliant and non-compliant mobile driver's license. So whether a physical card or a digital ID, it is up to the relying party to determine what to accept.